So now we're going to look at how dreams can be a gateway of experience to recognize the reality of the two worlds and how they work together. And there's this poem here, Journey in Dreams, that you should have there. And I'd like us to kind of use it as a song. So this side of the room can do the first stanza, and then this side of the room can do the second stanza. Okay, so for every season there is a choice, a time to die and a time to live, a time for decrease, a time for increase. For every beginning there is an ending, a time for regression and a time for growth, a time for saying goodbye and a time for greeting. For anything new, the old must go, a grave must be dug, a new seed planted, a sacrifice made as well.
Fulfillment created. The days of our lives are numbered by eternity, but those will never be again. The songs which have been sung are only an echo. We are as grains of sand in the infinitude of oceans. Our consciousness illumes life only in an instant. We are as nothing in the transcendent now.
And what we have not. What we will not be. What can end him is already a burden on our shoulders.
Where is my life going? Asked the seeker. To what end are all my choices? And for what purpose have I been born or unborn?
Yet still will I say, my refuge is in what is. My salvation is in what I do with what life brings me. My longing is within the sacred.
When I am no more, the rains will still fall, the seasons will swirl into eternity, and the voice of my lips will be somebody's song.
For I am not alone in my common humanity. I'm not alone in the journey towards wholeness. I am at peace where the center guides me, and I shall live in all my life. One of the things about dreams being a psychic event, it doesn't know time and space. That's why it already has a dimension of the eternal. Because dreams can have a function which prepares you for an event, that you live into an event. You may have you ever had a dream in which not long after, or maybe years afterwards, you actually live the event in the outer world? Or it can bring back a past event and have you recapture the experience to reflect and to reintegrate. So it has, it is one in which, and I gave you just a very short introduction, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on this because I want to spend more death dreams than a whole introduction to dream work. But what we can say about dreams is that they are not defined or created by the ego. We are the receiver. And that's why, people say, oh, I had this stupid dream. And I always say, the dream's not stupid, the interpreter is stupid. It's like, you get a card in Chinese and you say, oh, this is stupid. No, you just don't know the language. So it's the same thing. If you don't know your own language, you will make ego judgments about, oh, that was silly, or that was the pizza last night, or, we always tend to denigrate experiences of the unconscious. But these dreams also can be repetitive when a severe trauma has occurred. It may be preparing us for a future that we have not yet become initiated into. But what dreams do, and from my experience as a director, is they bridge us between the reality of this world and crosses over into the thin place, into the other world, and realize that this is one world. Now, I'm going to share some dreams from directees that I've gotten permission from in order to share their story with this. This comes from a mother who recently lost her son, who was, I think, 36 years old, and deep grief, loss, all the things you would expect, right? And she had this dream a few weeks ago, just very recently, and I asked her if I could use the dream for this workshop. In the dream, I'm in a store, and my phone rings in my purse. And I say to myself, oh, I'm not going to pay attention to it. I don't want to deal with it here. But it wasn't put on stop or whatever. It just kept on ringing. Again, it was, annoying her. So she left the store, and she's standing outside, and she takes her phone out. And she goes to voicemail, and it was from her son who had died. So, when she sees this, she's in shock, and she calls back, and Anthony answers the phone, and he goes, "Hi, Mom." And she says, "Anthony, I've missed you so much." And her son says, "I'm calling to let you know I'm okay. I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing now." And that was the end of the call. Now, what's interesting is when she initially got the dream, it was not actually a powerful dream. She just had, what we have a tendency to do is we tend to identify things as strange. I had this strange dream where Anthony called me, as if she was an observer, not a participant. In the dream, she's a participant. As soon as she told me the dream out loud, right, she got it, what it was saying. I'm okay. I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And it was a realization that her connection with her son is not gone. That there is still a connection. And he reached out to her to console her and to reassure her that he's okay. This is not unusual that you have these kinds of events. This was another directee who was with her mother who had died. And her mother had to go to the bathroom. And she was taken online, and it took a long time. And finally she got her into a stall, and she had to help her. And she needed to get some help, and I finally placed her in the toilet, and now it's okay, and she lets it go, and she says, "Thank you so much for giving me this chance." And there was some unfinished business between her and her mother. And it's like the mother let it go. The crap she was holding that was the blockage to her relationship to her daughter. And now her daughter helped her find a place to let it go. And interestingly enough, working with the directee, the secret of what this was about came out. And now she felt freer to be able to forgive her mother. There's another person who had the death of a significant other, and the body had been lost, and the priest is giving the candle, just has a little candle next to the coffin. And the person who's doing the organizing is saying, stop, this is not good enough. She goes into the sacristy and gets the Paschal candle and puts it next to the coffin and lights the Paschal candle. She realized that this death was more of a mystery than just the little candle, it's just the ego. The Paschal candle is Christ's candle. It's the bigger picture, the bigger mystery. Okay? All of these are dreams that give us hints about the fact that we are in relationship to those on the other side, and the other side are in relationship to us. We have a long tradition in Christianity and Catholicism is praying for the dead. It's a long, ancient tradition that continues into modern day. And Jung said that in Western civilization, the only thing that was left that connected people to the deceased was in the Catholic Church having masses for the dead or having celebrations for like All Saints and All Souls. It was the only tradition left in Christianity about a living relationship to the other side. And you see Catholic cultures have sustained that, by the respect due to the dying and the dead, and also celebrations around this. It's not like, for instance, on All Souls, right? In Mexico, people bring their dinner and they eat with the deceased to unite the generations. In Chicago, the Eastern Europeans do the same thing. We're bringing food on a Sunday and eating on the grave, with the beloved. So there is this tradition of living relationship with those who have gone before. My mother, the day before she died, everyone she saw was on the other side. Like I was my father, my sister was her mother. She was in that thin place that all the people that were here were not here anymore. She was crossing over. Her imagery of life was now moving towards those who had already crossed over. So, eternity, Jung, and dreams. There's a quote here. He says, my hypothesis is that we can do so with the aid from hints sent to us from the unconscious. In dreams, for example, usually we dismiss these hints because we're convinced that the question is not susceptible to answer. So the question is, we don't think there's an answer about the afterlife. So we forget that there are answers. We're just not attuned to them. In response to this understandable skeptic, I suggest the following considerations. If there is something we cannot know, we must necessarily abandon it as an intellectual problem. For example, I do not know for what reason the universe came into being, and shall never know. Therefore, I must drop this question as a scientist or intellectual problem. But if an idea about it is offered to me in dreams or in mythic tradition, I ought to take note of it. I even ought to build up a conception on the basis of such hints, even though it will forever remain a hypothesis which I know cannot be proved. So here's the difference between faith and knowledge. You may have faith that there is an afterlife. When you say the creed manifests a belief in the afterlife and resurrection of the dead, and all the things we believe. But it's amazing that though we say we believe in this, when we have an experience of it, we don't believe it. Okay, so we give testimony on Easter, I believe, with a candle, this is what I believe in. And when I have an actual encounter, I'm saying it must be the pizza that I ate the night before. giving me indigestion. Do you see what I'm trying to say here? In other words, there are lots, Jung says, hints which don't prove it scientifically, but certainly give a manifestation to the fact that there's something beyond my understanding. So let's look at intuitive realization. So what are the things that I can intuit? When I worked in Oakland with inner city children, many of them, it was in the 80s and early 90s, when there was hardly a family that had not been affected by violence, you know, and many parents were killed, you know, the wrong place, wrong time, you know, housing projects, you know, all that kind of stuff. And it was so devastating and so common that I started grieving groups for children, you know, of different age groups, so that they could come together and talk about their experience and talk about their fears and anxieties. And what came up, even without my asking, was almost every child at every level has some kind of dream in which their parent showed up and gave a reassuring message that they were okay. Now, when shared in a group, more than a person, it has a great deal of power. So when you start sharing them in a group, right, it's like, I may doubt, but this person had it, and this person had it, and this person had it. That it became not only a consolation for them in the grieving process, it became a place where they could trust life again. You know, rather than hiding from life, they could trust life again. I have a directee who recently shared this that she had, and this she shared with me last week. And what's fascinating to me is, as soon as I started writing this reflection, I kept getting all of these examples from directees out of nowhere. You know, like all of a sudden it was like the floodgates. And here, both of her parents are deceased. Her mother just died this fall. I dream I'm in a doctor's office and there are these health envelopes. And in these envelopes, there are recordings from people who had been the doctor's patients. And this was her mother's envelope, okay? But what was really odd is that there were they were all recordings of her mother. And there were recordings after the date that she had died. So she would listen to the recordings, you know, until her death, and then she'd listen to the other recordings. And she says, I think this is so strange because she made it after her own death. It's now February and she died in September. I play it and my mother says, hello, darling, I'm fine, and your father's standing here next to me. That was it. Now, why did it come at this point? We don't know. You know, this is like, can you hold the mystery of not knowing the timing or the place or what's going on here? Something was stimulating in her about the fact that her mother's health and her being extends beyond her death date. Like it's not over. That was the important thing for her, you know? She's still recording. She's still communicating, okay? And what's interesting is, you know, she's British, so it's like, hello, darling. You know, I can hear the British accent, you know, and your father's here by my side. In the face of mortality, And it says it in Deuteronomy, in the face of death, choose life. That's one of the most important words. In the face of death, choose life. I think that's not just the ego choosing life. It's some part of me, deeper than my ego, that continues to choose life even after I've encountered death. So it reiterates that there is a continuity. All the dreams that I just shared says there's a continuity between this life and the next life. And there may be changes in the person that you had a relationship with in the afterlife that they need to reintroduce themselves in this life. With Anthony, he had lots of problems in his life and never fully lived out his dreams, his goals. And in the dream, he says, not only am I okay, I'm doing exactly what I need to do now. So what he couldn't fulfill here, he is in some way fulfilling there, whatever that means. So, I think some of the worst sides of our culture is, like when teenagers destroy, tombstones, especially in Jewish cemeteries, horrible stuff, because that's really attacking the sacredness of life, the sacredness of spirit. Because you notice, and I know some of you worked in hospice, isn't there in the container as a person is dying almost like a religious space? People whisper, there's a sacredness there. It's like, you truly experience the holy in that space. So these patterns of death dreams can initiate us into the fact that, the people that we think have crossed over, they are still in relationship to us. It develops a religious outlook, against the materialistic bias that I have. Envisions that there may be a possibility of meaning in the death process. And to recognize that death dreams, or my own death dreams, may be indicative of what it is that you need to let go of. And it may not mean literally materialistic death. It may mean, what are you attached to? Are you attached to the heroic myth? Are you attached to the fact that you're still in charge? What do you need to die to? In that paradoxical reading, right? You gotta die before you can live, and in the dying you're born. So these death dreams are a way of understanding consolation, revelation, to recognize that there is an other side. And what's very interesting, the projections that we have had in our Western culture. We identified primitive people who had a sense of the holy in nature. We saw them as being primitive, when in really, spiritually, they were awakened in relationship to us. Okay? So, the question is, can you journal about the little deaths in your life? When were the times in which your life was immersed in mystery, and you had to trust that there was some light at the end of the tunnel and you didn't know what it was? To integrate death dreams, are we willing to sacrifice? This was the thing the Father talked about this morning. It's like, are we willing to make holy, to sacrifice our ego attachments to a higher nature? And can we learn that when people have gone before us, there is still a way to be in relationship. Now, there's a lot of material there that you can read on your own. I want to do the case studies before lunch, okay? So there's a page there called Case Material Dreams and Inner Events. This was a former directee of mine, a mother of 4 who lost her 8-year-old child from cancer. She sees in her dream her 3 other children and her husband are in a church. The Blessed Sacrament is exposed as if it was going to have Eucharistic adoration. Her husband and 3 other children are there, but they're asleep. Her deceased daughter is awake and glowing before the sacrament. So what is it saying? What? To a grieving mother. What did it say to a grieving mother? That she's awake. We're the ones that are asleep. She gets what's happening. We don't. It's like the apostles falling asleep when Jesus is awake. You know? And that her daughter of 8 already knows what the vision is, what the reality is. That we're the ones that are impoverished. We're the ones that are still in the dark. Her deceased daughter is awake and glowing before the sacrament. See, that's a great consolation, right? It doesn't take away the pain of her daughter not being there. But in her religious tradition, it puts a context that as she's crossed over, she is now totally present before the presence. And the rest of us are kind of like stumbling along the way and half asleep and half awake, and we're not quite there yet. This is a young man that I worked with, a young adult, 22, where his father died 7 years earlier. And he had a repeated dream of his father comes home from work as usual, goes into the backyard, and he starts digging a grave, and jumps in, but he can't bury himself. And he's very frustrated. And he's asking for his son to help. And his father says, I am God's hands, now let me go and live your life. This is a good example of unfinished grief. And the young man believed that his life was over. And he kept his father alive in a way as if he was going to come back one day. And he had to give up that dream. He had to bury his father, even though he was buried 7 years earlier. You see the difference between something that's literal and something that's figurative and symbolic? He was literally buried, but he wasn't buried in his psyche. He was a disturbance so that he could not live his life. And that's quite the message. He looks at his son and says, please, I am in God's hands, now let me go and live your life. In 1995, when the AIDS epidemic was, reaching its peak, a former student of mine that I taught in St. Agnes High School in New York was dying of AIDS. And whenever I would come into New York, I would visit him and his mother. And towards the end of his life, I didn't have a lot of experience in this, but it was a horrific death. He was so overwhelmed with boils and suffering, and single mother in a high rise in the projects of New York. It was like, it was just an agony just to go visit. But the mother, when I came in for his, here's another thing of synchronicity. My schedule, as usual, was crazy, and I knew he was going to die. And I said to her, I don't know if I'll be able to be here for his funeral. I was living in San Francisco at the time. Well, all of a sudden I'm asked to go to a meeting in New York the day after his burial, his funeral. So the province paid for my travel. I came a day early. I was able to be there. And at his funeral, his mother told me on the day of his death, he woke up from a coma and he said to his mother, "There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And at the end, there's a gigantic, beautiful birthday cake." And at the end of the day, he dies. What a consolation to her to recognize that, all the stuff that we talk about in the liturgy, eternal life and blah, blah, blah. She had a real encounter with this through him. Because he had the encounter before he died about the birthday cake. Number 4, this was a very interesting situation. I had a directee who had a business trip and went to Sacramento from the Bay Area. And even back then, the traffic is horrible, It could take 2 hours, it could take 2 days, who knows? Bring food and water because you just don't know what all the traffic's gonna be. And on her way, she had this incredible experience in which all the trees and everything around her became like crystal, like diamonds. And they were so bright that she couldn't drive. She had to pull over, and she thought she was having something wrong with her eyes, that some dialectic problem with her eyes. And then, she comes to spiritual direction in between, and we talk about it and, process it. A week after direction, she dies of a stroke. And I think that this waking dream was in anticipation of seeing reality as it really is and not how we see it. That everything is a manifestation of God. Everything is this crystallized moment. There was a person who was preparing for death, and I was journeying with him in that process. And he had repeated dreams of midnight, except there was like a few seconds before. And he would always wake up before it would hit midnight. And I think, midnight is the witching hour. This is the end of the day, the beginning of the new. It's the liminal period. And before he died, he was getting these synchronistic events constantly about midnight. Like it was saying, are you getting ready? Are you prepared? Are you doing the inner work? So much so that he had a dream about a Broadway play, and he couldn't understand what the meaning of this dream was, but in the dream, the song was memory, the song Memory. The first word is midnight. So he was being bombarded with this. And I think by taking it in, that, this was a passage, and he was seconds before, there was always seconds before, it was like, don't be afraid. Allow yourself to experience it. And I was privileged to be with him and his family in that dying process. Grieving groups, that I worked with children, living in between realities. There's also dreams that are dreams/visions. And they're a dream, and then you wake up and the dream continues. I don't know if you've ever had that experience where it's like you're not quite in the dream state or quite completely there. But I had a very powerful dream of Thomas Merton at the end of my bed. And yet, I couldn't identify him because he was Father Lewis in the dream, which is what his name was, in Gethsemane. And I think he became, I've done a lot of work on him and workshops and so forth. I think there's a way in which you create spiritual companions in life. We're going to talk about tomorrow, the communion of saints, the men and women who have gone before, who have, prepared us for this. Sometimes dreams give us unknown elements in our story. This was a woman who had repeated dreams of being ripped apart. She like being dissected, being ripped apart. And, she had no idea of what it could mean. And the thing is, archetypally, the symbol of being ripped apart is initiation. You're ripped apart and put together in a different way. But we couldn't find the meaning of the dream until she had this long conversation with her mother, in which her mother had been depressed when she was pregnant, and she had seriously considered an abortion, and was just about ready to have it and decided not to. And I think this had to do with her anxiety, even as a fetus, of feeling threatened. Because we know that there are prenatal experiences, the Groffs and others who have studied this, that even in the fetus, we can pick up a lot of what's going on around us and in the bodies of our mothers. So that was a big opening for her to kind of look at her life, both in gratitude, but also, compassion for her mother, and how her mother, I think, carried a lot of guilt throughout her life about this, and it was a great reconciliation. There's also this synchronicity here, which we'll talk about this afternoon. What happens when there's an event that's going on inside, which parallels an event that's going on outside, which is what we're going to talk about this afternoon, the synchronistic piece. And in this person's life, they had a dream of a glorious birth at the same time that a very good friend, without them knowing, had died, literally at the same time. Now, this is the soul-friend connection. Their souls were connected in such a way that the experience of one becomes the experience of the other. And all of these dreams and case studies that I'm bringing up is indicative of don't dismiss the signs. There are signs all the time around us and inside of us. Don't poo-poo it, because what happens is there's a disconnect between what I say I believe and what I question, what I experience. And oftentimes it's the same thing. If I believe, then do I also live it out? So we are here, we have a question. If I ever experience a death dream, this is something maybe you can think about this afternoon. What pattern was it revealing to me? When I image death, what images, emotions, or stories arrive to provide wisdom? If you've been with others who have died, and some of you have done this ministry, so you're with hundreds of people, how has the death of a significant other informed me about this fullness of reality? In what ways have I experienced little deaths? And Jung said, if we don't allow ourselves to experience the little deaths, we won't know what the big death really means like. If we don't befriend the letting go process, then we're going to be more and more rigid as we get older about not letting go. If letting go has become an art form, then it's not going to be such a burden. And what are some of my conscious fears of death? Or for many people, the fear of dying, not just death itself. So to end this section is to realize that dreams are a main way, and we see them in Scripture, we see them in the Hebrew Scriptures, we also see them in the Christian Scriptures, how, Saint Joseph would have no role if he didn't interpret dreams. All he did in the short passage of those few chapters in Luke and Matthew was interpret dreams and acted on them. So dreams are always a place of, and the deeper the emotional construct that's going on, like grieving, the deeper that response will come from the unconscious. And grief is one of those things that push the ego down further and further until we get a message of wisdom or consolation or some kind of form. So this afternoon, we're going to meet at 1 o'clock, and what we're going to look at is synchronicity and life after life experiences, and a little bit about the Catholic imagination. How in Catholicism we have an imaginative dimension of paradox, how things don't work linearly, how things are kind of encircled. It's not about rational mind, it's not about irrational, it's about how do we befriend the non-rational. So any last minute comments or questions before we finish up?
I tend to think death is not taking life away, but coming into the fullness of life.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I'm struggling with terminology here and there.
Yeah.
Is it more an intense experience of here?
Exactly, and that's why we're going to do synchronicity and Jung's relationship to Pauli, the physicist, about the fact that his basic premise is there is only one here. But we're not in tune. We have blocked the other, so the other has become there. And that's why we call the so-called primitive didn't see the distinction. Our materialistic and rational mind has created all these distinctions. So the truly spiritual are attuned to nature and seeing death and resurrection, not only in nature, but in our own nature and in the life of those who have gone before us.
Then that brings me to, can there be waking dreams? Like do people like they'll see a beautiful sunset or something and know that the loved one is well?
Absolutely.
A butterfly or whatever.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about symbols that connect the presence of the beloved, because that's where the synchronicity comes in.
I think the symbolism of the veil
Yes.
really applies here.
Yeah, the veil.
Some veils you can see through,
Yeah,
and yet when we're in these bodies,
that's right.
there is a separation of sorts.
There is a there's a separation from our conception of reality. It's kind of like, I use the example of, when you have lost a limb and you still have pain in that limb, it's phantom. It's a phantom pain. It's not really lost, but you feel like it's lost. And that's why I think these dreams of consolation are really not just consolation, they're awakening dreams to the reality that what is described or affected as deep grief and loss is just a manifestation of another life.
When my brother-in-law died, my sister, they had taken some family pictures because they knew he was dying of cancer, and so the photographer took the pictures, told her 8-year-old son that he had died, and they were somewhere walking on the beach, and he's walking around, and so she said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm looking for William's orb." And she said she didn't pay much attention to this because he's done this before. And he said, "I found it. His orb is blue. It's not like some cousin or uncle that died.
Right.
That, because the uncle, cousin, couple of them had committed suicide,
Wow.
and theirs were red, but he said, I found William's orb, and he's okay, and now we can let it go.
Yeah.
So, it's,
Yeah, there are ways in which, and we have to trust the means of communication because they're non-rational. You know, and oftentimes they're symbolic and we don't get the message right away. You know? Even though it's very clear what the message is saying, we won't let it in. Because if we let it in, we also have to deal with the other side of not only consolation, but the reality of the grief that they're not here in the old way. So we have to, in order to have the consolation, we have to grieve more intensely the loss of the physicality of this person in our environment, because it's real. And like I said, in the last 2 months, most of these dreams have come up, you know, with my own directees. And they didn't know I was working on this, but it just seemed to being bombarded constantly with this kind of material. So I would believe that there's some power that wanted that material to be brought to you in some way, to touch you in your own experience. That this is not, in a way, this is a person's own scripture. You know, this is the life of a person. This is the scriptural. You know, some saints said that each, you know, de Caussade said that each person is a living gospel and is a manifestation of Christ. So this, you know, to tell the person's story is to know the life of Christ again and again and again. And that's why, you know, being a spiritual director is such a privileged position, because you hear people's deep stories and you see the incarnation of how God works in somebody so different from X, Y, and Z, but each a touching into the mystery. Okay? So we'll come back at 1, right? And then we will meet tonight at